Leave immediately. You're trespassing on HOA property. That's how my Tuesday morning began, with the HOA president screaming at me and then dialing 911 like she'd just uncovered a federal crime. There's a dangerous man illegally occupying our community building, she told the dispatcher, referring to my own inherited lake office. I stayed seated, sipping coffee, watching her unravel like a soap opera villain. The best part? I knew something she didn't. When the sheriff finally pulled up and ran my ID through the federal system, her expression drained of color. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "you just called the police on the legal owner of this property." But believe it or not, that wasn't even her biggest surprise. Comment below, where in the world are you tuning in from to watch this chaos? It was an ordinary Tuesday. I was at my desk in the lakefront office, working peacefully on my laptop. A steaming mug of coffee sat beside me. Morning sunlight poured in through the windows, and for a moment, everything in life felt perfectly aligned. I was updating a few expense reports, nothing thrilling, just day-to-day work. That's when I noticed her approaching, visible through the window. She marched across the lawn like she was leading a battalion into enemy territory. In her hands was a thick folder, clenched like a weapon. Her face, if looks could kill, I'd have dropped dead before she even made it to the door. She didn't knock. The door flew open, and in barged a woman I'd later come to know as Samantha Wellington, the HOA president. "Get out!" she shrieked, her face flushed with fury. "You can't just open an office here without HOA permission." Now, I've encountered all kinds of personalities over the years, but this level of hostility, right off the bat, caught me off guard. I didn't even bother looking up. "And a good morning to you," I said calmly, raising my cup. "Coffee? You seem a beat a broken bar wound up." That comment nearly sent her into orbit. "Don't get smart with me," she snapped. "This building isn't for personal business. You think you can just barge in and ignore all the rules?" Finally, I looked at her. She had that air someone used to people backing down at the first sign of her raised voice. Her posture practically screamed fake authority. "What if I told you," I said casually, "that I actually own this building?" Her laugh was harsh and disbelieving, like I'd told the world's worst joke. "I don't care what lies you think you can get away with," she snapped, waving the folder around like she was conducting an orchestra of rage. "You need HOA authorization to run any kind of business on these premises, and guess what? I'm the one who gives it." Here's where it got entertaining. Most people would have argued or gotten flustered. I just kept sipping my coffee and watching the storm unfold. "Ma'am," I said, as calmly as before, "you're absolutely within your rights to call whoever you feel necessary if you believe there's an issue." That pushed her right over the edge. "Fine," she yelled, pulling her phone out like she was drawing a sword. "You've got 5 minutes to shut this place down, or I'm calling the cops." Most people would have been at least a little uneasy. Having the police called on you isn't exactly a dream way to kick off your day. But me, I was honestly looking forward to it. Because Samantha Wellington had no idea who she was dealing with. I leaned back in my chair and replied, "Please, feel free. I'll be right here." The fury on her face was almost theatrical. Her hands were trembling as she dialed 911, breathing like a bull ready to charge. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher's voice echoed loud enough for me to catch from across the room. "I need the police immediately," Samantha shouted into the phone. "There's a man running an unauthorized business in our HOA building. He's refusing to comply with community rules." I couldn't help chuckling. "Ma'am," I said loudly enough for the operator to hear, "I'm just handling basic expense reports." That's it. Nothing shady. But she wasn't listening. She hung up, arms folded triumphantly like she'd just won a battle. "Let's see how tough you are when the cops get here," she said smugly, as if she'd sealed my fate. I nodded, returning to my typing. "Should be fun," I said, taking another sip. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have possibly guessed, was that I was actually relieved the sheriff was on his way. This wasn't going to go how she thought. Not even close. You see, Samantha was about to learn a very important lesson, the kind that sticks with someone for a lifetime. I watched her stand there, arms crossed, radiating righteous fury. But outside, I could already see the sheriff's cruiser rolling into the drive. And I'll be honest, I did feel a little bad for what was about to happen. Just a little. Because folks like Samantha are the self-appointed rule enforcers, they get so used to throwing their weight around, they forget that consequences apply to them, too. They're so used to people caving in at the first sign of confrontation that they stop expecting resistance, and every once in a while, they pick the wrong person to challenge. As Sheriff Morgan stepped out of the car, I knew Samantha had no clue who she had just tried to throw out. The autumn leaves drifted lazily outside, peaceful and slow, a perfect contrast to the storm she had just stirred up. But what happens next? What will the sheriff uncover when he checks my ID? Let's just say a broken bar. Samantha's day was about to take a dramatic turn. Thank goodness you're here. He's operating an unauthorized office and refuses to comply with HOA policies. Samantha's voice cut through the morning air like a siren as she waved that oversized folder like it was a weapon of justice. I watched her from inside, pulling out what appeared to be months of notes and so-called evidence. She'd clearly been gearing up for a full-blown battle, and she thought she'd just summoned reinforcements. Little did she know, she'd actually made a serious misstep. Sheriff Morgan, ever the consummate professional, approached the situation with that calm, seasoned energy of a man who's probably handled every kind of suburban dispute imaginable. "All right, ma'am," he said in that steady tone that only experienced officers seem to perfect. "Let me get the full story." "Sir," he called to me, "I'm going to need to see some ID." Now here's where things took a sharp turn. Samantha was practically bouncing in place with smug anticipation. She was fully convinced I was about to be exposed, that my identification would be bogus, that I'd panic, and she'd be hailed as the neighborhood's enforcer of order. "Of course, officer," I said without skipping a beat, reaching into my wallet, happy to cooperate. I handed him my federal credentials, and I watched closely as he inspected them. At first, it was business as usual, a quick glance at the kind anyone gives a standard license. But then a broken bar. He paused. He looked again, this time much closer. I saw the exact moment his face changed. "Dispatch," he said into his radio, voice suddenly firmer, more official. "I need federal confirmation on badge ID." He read off the number, and Samantha, still unaware, gave a loud, satisfied huff. "See?" she said loud enough for everyone to hear. "Probably fake. People like that will try anything." "And then a broken bar." The radio crackled. "Confirmed," came the response, loud and unmistakable. "Active FBI agent, verified credentials." And just like that, Samantha's smug grin disappeared. Sheriff Morgan's demeanor shifted instantly. This was no longer just a neighborhood squabble. Now he was standing beside a federal agent, and the woman who had dragged him into this was beginning to look like someone who had made a massive mistake. He turned and looked at Samantha again, but not the way he had before. This time, it was the look an officer gives when he realizes something far bigger is unfolding. Now let me describe what happened next, because it was the kind of moment you couldn't script any better if you tried. Sheriff Morgan faced her and, in a slow, weighty voice that only cops delivering devastating news seem to use, said, "Ma'am, you just called 911 on an FBI agent who also owns the building you're trying to remove him from." If I could have frozen time to capture her reaction, I would have. That confident look cracked like shattered glass. The folder she'd been holding so tightly slipped from her grasp. Papers scattered across the yard, caught by the breeze like broken pieces of her failed plan A or confetti at the worst celebration ever. The silence was deafening. Samantha stood frozen, her mouth moving but no sound coming out, like a fish gasping for air. You could almost see her mind glitching as it tried and failed to process what she'd just heard. "Fa broken bar FBI?" she finally choked out. Her voice cracked, barely a whisper. "That a broken bar? That can't be. He's just some guy who moved in 2 months ago." But Sheriff Morgan wasn't even looking at her anymore. His attention was on me now, and the professional respect in his eyes told me it was time to drop the friendly neighbor act. Old instincts kicked in like they never left. You don't spend years working federal cases without that muscle memory setting in. I stood up slowly from my desk, my posture shifting completely. Gone was the relaxed, casual tone. My voice dropped into that calm, commanding register trained by years of service. The energy in the room changed immediately. "Sheriff Morgan," I said, extending my hand, Thanks for showing up so quickly. Mrs. Wellington just handed me the final piece of evidence I needed for an investigation I've been running for the last 4 months. Samantha's face contorted in panic. Investigation? She stammered. I could see her fingers twitching. What investigation? I haven't done anything wrong. That's when I took out my phone. Both of them watched as I scrolled through my contacts. I need to contact my office at the FBI, I said flatly. We'll need to bring in backup. That word backup landed like a punch to Samantha's gut. Backup? She repeated, her voice hollow. Suddenly, she wasn't the firestorm who had stormed into my office. She seemed much smaller, more fragile, like the wind might blow her over. All that bravado, the authority, the fury, the self-righteous control was draining out of Samantha like water leaking from a cracked dam. She was no longer the feared HOA president known for her iron grip on the neighborhood. She was just a woman who had finally begun to understand that she might have made the biggest mistake of her life. By this point, curious neighbors were starting to gather. That's just how these communities work. A police presence and raised voices spread faster than wildfire. Faces appeared in windows, porch doors swung open, and people stepped outside, craning their necks for a better look. Then I noticed someone familiar. Fred Grant, the retired accountant from 2 doors down. He was approaching slowly, clearly unsure of what he was walking into. Fred was one of the few neighbors I'd taken time to chat with since moving in. Intelligent, careful, and noticeably uneasy anytime home matters came up. Rob? He called, voice laced with concern. What's going on, Fred? I responded with the same friendly tone he was used to hearing from me. You remember those questions you had about the HOA budget, when the numbers didn't seem to make sense? Fred nodded slowly, eyes narrowing with realization. Well, I said, you were absolutely right to be concerned. And in that moment, I saw it hit him. The truth behind the numbers, the strange discrepancies. His gaze shifted to Samantha, and his whole face changed. You mean she was actually a question mark? Exactly, I said. And thanks to her calling the police on me this morning, I finally have all the evidence I need to move this case forward. That's when Samantha snapped a final attempt to grasp for control. This is entrapment, she screamed, her voice trembling with panic. You set me up. You can't do this. I looked at her the way you'd look at a child mid-tantrum, calm, unmoved. Ma'am, I said, entrapment only applies when someone is pressured into committing a crime they otherwise wouldn't have committed. You were stealing from your neighbors long before I showed up. I just documented it. Before she could respond, the sound of approaching vehicles cut through the moment. I turned toward the road with a slight smile. That, I said, glancing at my watch, would be the other FBI agents I called. 4 months of slow, methodical investigation. 4 months of gathering proof, playing the part, and staying quiet. All of it had led to this moment. Game over. But the real question, how did an FBI agent end up embedded in a suburban HOA? Anna Drama-nest viewers, what do you think Rob uncovered that made the Bureau take such a deep interest in this case? The second I mentioned backup, I watched Samantha's world begin to collapse right in front of me. Her face cycled through the 5 unmistakable stages of panic: denial, rage, desperation, despair, and finally, dread. FBI agents? She repeated, her voice getting higher and more unsteady with every syllable. You call it a broken bar? More FBI agents? The way she emphasized more told me she'd finally realized how far over her head she was. Sheriff Morgan stepped back, and I saw his eyes widen at the moment he understood this was no longer a neighborly dispute. His tone changed completely when he addressed me. Agent Hayes, a broken bar? What exactly are we looking at here? It was the moment I'd been waiting 4 months to reach. Sheriff, I said, what we're dealing with is a long-running financial fraud operation disguised as home management. I glanced at Samantha. Her complexion was visibly paler now. Mrs. Wellington has been systematically embezzling money from her neighbors. She created fake contractor invoices, charged unauthorized fees, and threatened legal action against anyone who questioned her. The transformation in my own presence was complete now. No longer was I the laid-back, quiet guy in the lake office. I had shifted fully back into agent mode. My posture firmed, my voice dropped into the commanding cadence of federal authority. Gone was Rob, The unassuming new resident, standing before them now, was FBI agent Robert Hayes. The shift was like replacing a dusty light bulb with a spotlight. Something about the air even felt different, as if the entire neighborhood was holding its breath. Even the birds had gone silent. "That's not possible," Samantha finally croaked out, but all the dominance had drained from her voice. "I've been a respected part of this community," she stammered. "I've served as HOA president for 4 years. I've improved property values. I've upheld standards." But even as she tried to cling to her credentials, her voice was cracking. I could see the doubt seeping in. She was replaying all those budget meetings in her head, the ones where she refused to answer questions, where she deflected any demand for transparency. And now, it was all coming back to haunt her. Samantha's threats, her intimidation tactics, her illusion of control, all of it was crumbling. Her carefully constructed house of lies was collapsing, and she could feel every piece falling apart beneath her. That's when I walked calmly back to my desk and picked up my folder, the real one, the one I'd been compiling for 4 months, not the expense reports I pretended to be updating earlier. "Mrs. Wellington," I began, flipping it open and laying out pages for all to see. "The best part of being a federal investigator is that we don't make assumptions. We collect evidence, then we act." The documents inside told a story that needed no narration. Forged invoices, altered bank records, email trails, and transaction logs. Every page was another nail in the coffin of her carefully hidden fraud. By now, even more residents were gathering, drawn by the patrol car, the tension in the air, and the buzz of something big unfolding. It felt like the moment before a storm hits. Fred Grant stepped closer again, joined by several other neighbors, familiar faces I'd spoken to over the past 2 months. These were folks who'd quietly voiced concern, who'd questioned why fees were rising or why their requests were met with hostility. Now, they were about to get the answers they'd been denied for years. "Fred," I called, motioning him over, "come take a look." He approached carefully, but the moment his eyes landed on the papers, his expression shifted from curiosity to shock, then to righteous anger. "Are those the real contractor bills?" he asked, pointing with a hand that trembled slightly. "They are," I confirmed. "Those are the invoices Mrs. Wellington submitted to the HOA for payment." I flipped to another set of papers. "And these are the actual receipts from the contractors." Notice the difference in cost. Fred's eyes scanned the sheets, and I could practically see the numbers calculating in his head. "She charged us $2,400 for tree removal," he said, his voice rising. "But the real cost was $600? His voice got louder with every word, and neighbors leaned in, drawn by the fire in his tone. "So where did the other $1,800 go?" That question cut through the crowd like lightning. Everyone knew the answer, but they needed to hear it. I pulled out another document and laid it down gently. "It was funneled into a private account," I said, "one Mrs. Wellington used to make car payments, pay off personal expenses, even book vacations." The collective gasp was immediate. Samantha looked around, frantic, her eyes darting from face to face, searching for support that no longer existed. "She also created fake companies," I continued, "billed the HOA for phantom services, imposed emergency assessments for non-existent problems, and silenced anyone who asked to see the financials with legal threats." Every sentence struck like a blow. I watched the crowd shift from disbelief to anger, not just at the crimes, but at the years of silence they'd suffered under her leadership. This wasn't mismanagement. It wasn't an honest mistake. This was a calculated, long-term scheme, a theft dressed up in the costume of community service. The evidence laid out before them didn't just prove fraud, it revealed betrayal and a kind that violates trust on a deeply personal level. But I was protecting property values. Samantha suddenly shouted, her voice cracking with desperation. Her tone was no longer commanding, it was confused, pleading, like she still couldn't understand why the tide had turned. "Everything I did was for the good of the neighborhood. No one else was willing to step up. You people don't know how hard it is to maintain order when everyone just wants to ignore the rules." It was the classic defense of the guilty, claim noble intentions, blame the victims, and deny the growing mountain of proof sitting in front of everyone. Before she could spiral further, the sound of engines caught everyone's attention. I turned toward the road and smiled. 3 black SUVs rolled into view, the kind that make everyone go quiet because they know what they represent. Serious federal presence. I glanced at my watch. Perfect timing. "Mrs. Wellington," I said, folding the folder shut and locking eyes with her, "you didn't just try to claim the wrong building as HOA property, you tried to intimidate the wrong FBI agent." Car doors slammed shut in unison, a thunderous punctuation mark to what had just been revealed. Samantha's last trace of color drained from her face as realization finally broke through her fog of denial. Agent Harris stepped out of the lead vehicle, flanked by 2 more agents, calm, sharp, and already scanning the area like pros. I turned to the neighbors. "Everyone, these are the federal agents I've been working with." It took 4 months of investigation, planning, and documentation, a broken bar, but the time has come. Justice wasn't just knocking. It had arrived, and there was no turning back. Anna Drama-nest viewers, what do you think happens next? What kind of punishment should someone face for turning a community into their personal bank account? So, what exactly did Samantha do that required federal intervention? And just how deep did the money trail go? Let me take you back to the beginning, months before I ever set foot in that lakefront office. This story really started when I inherited the property from my grandmother, Eleanor Hayes. For more than 20 years, she'd quietly run her small accounting firm out of that office. But Eleanor wasn't just any accountant. She was from the old school, the kind who believed that numbers always told the truth, and if they didn't add up, there was a reason worth finding. While sorting through her belongings after the funeral, I came across something that instantly triggered my instincts as a federal investigator. Tucked inside her files were years' worth of HOA financial records, and scrawled across the top of one folder in her familiar, meticulous handwriting was a single note: "Something doesn't smell right here. Someone needs to look into this before it gets worse." My grandmother had been quietly monitoring the HOA's financial discrepancies for nearly 4 years, spotting patterns that would make any forensic accountant take a second look. And when someone with 4 decades of accounting experience raises that kind of red flag, you don't ignore it. The deeper I went into her records, the clearer it became the problems had started around the time Samantha Wellington took over as HOA president. There were payments to contractors that didn't match industry pricing, mysterious assessments with no explanations, and most notably, a repeated refusal to provide residents with transparent budget information. As someone who specializes in financial crimes, I couldn't just walk away, but I also knew that approaching a seemingly legitimate HOA with subpoenas and FBI badges could backfire. You don't treat a neighborhood like a mob ring unless you have rock-solid proof. So, I made a bold choice. One my supervisor initially called ridiculous. I requested an extended leave of absence and moved into my grandmother's old office under the radar. I posed as a regular resident with the goal of uncovering the truth from the inside, slowly, quietly, and legally. The plan was straightforward in theory but complex in execution. Get close, gather irrefutable evidence, and build a federal case so airtight that no defense lawyer could dismiss it as some petty host squabble. But I wasn't ready for just how bold Samantha's scheme had become. Within my very first week living there, she hit me with 2 violations, infractions that didn't exist anywhere in the HOA bylaws. Then came a mysterious $50 new resident processing fee that wasn't mentioned in any community documentation, and when I politely asked to review the budget, she threatened legal action. Now, most people would have been shaken, but for me, every baseless charge and threat she threw my way was another piece of evidence I logged for the case. As I continued digging, the truth came into sharper focus. This wasn't minor embezzlement or casual mismanagement. Samantha had engineered a multi-layered fraud scheme, one that crossed state lines and involved phantom businesses. She'd created fake companies in Nevada and Arizona. These businesses submitted invoices for HOA services like landscaping and emergency repairs, some dramatically overpriced, others for work that never happened. And no one questioned it. After all, she was the president, who was going to challenge her financial decisions? That's where Fred Grant entered the picture, though he didn't realize at the time just how important he was. Fred is a retired corporate accountant with over 3 decades of experience. When you've been staring at numbers your whole career, Spotting something suspicious becomes second nature. Fred had been raising the alarm for over 2 years, asking reasonable questions like why routine services were suddenly triple the usual price or why emergency fees kept popping up without any real emergency. For daring to ask those questions, Samantha retaliated. She slapped him with $2,400 in violation fees for supposed landscaping issues on his property, violations that existed only in her imagination, but came dressed in official-looking letters backed by legal threats. But Fred wasn't the type to back down. When someone tried to bully him with fake authority, he stood his ground. He saved everything, every letter, every fake invoice, every threat. For 2 straight years, he quietly built his own archive of evidence without even knowing it. I met Fred during my second week living in the community. Earning his trust wasn't hard. He was desperate to find someone who'd actually listen. When he finally opened up, he took me to a file cabinet stuffed with records he'd been collecting. He didn't realize just how valuable that collection would be to a federal case. "These numbers don't make sense, Rob," he said one afternoon while we sifted through budget records that Samantha had reluctantly released after repeated requests. "I've been doing accounting longer than that woman's been alive, and I'm telling you, someone is stealing money from this place." If only Fred had known exactly who he was talking to, someone with not only the same concerns, but the tools and authority to do something about it. I often find myself wondering what might have happened if my grandmother hadn't been so obsessive about keeping records. Would Samantha still be out there, quietly siphoning money from hard-working families, tearing apart a peaceful neighborhood from the inside? It's a chilling thought, one that makes me grateful for people like her, people who care enough to dig into the details. Once you knew what to look for, the signs of fraud were everywhere. Phantom invoices from companies that didn't actually exist, transfers to bank accounts tied to Samantha's family, HOA funds being funneled into personal expenses, car notes, vacation homes, and more. She wasn't just mismanaging money, she was running a full-scale theft operation. Samantha billed the community for services never delivered, padded contracts, and bullied anyone who dared to question her methods. Her intimidation tactics fell tripped from the pages of a mafia playbook. But the most incriminating evidence, that came straight from Samantha herself. Her own emails and texts revealed how she plotted to hide expenses from the community, threatened to place liens on the homes of those who spoke up, and worked with her shell companies to pad invoices. She believed she was untouchable, so much so that she left behind a digital trail of nearly every criminal act. What pushed this beyond local enforcement was not just the $47,000 she siphoned off over the course of 4 years, it was how she did it. Her scheme involved interstate wire transfers, the use of the U.S. Postal Service to send fake bills and legal threats, and a consistent pattern of racketeering that fell squarely within the scope of federal RICO laws. When someone uses national communication systems to commit fraud, and that fraud spreads across state lines, the FBI gets very interested. The Old Lake office turned out to be the perfect vantage point. From there, I was able to quietly observe day-to-day HOA activities, interact with residents, and gather evidence without arousing suspicion. I had placed discreet surveillance gear that recorded Samantha's aggressive phone calls, caught every bogus fine she issued, and helped create a detailed record of financial misconduct going back years. But it wasn't just about the money. What mattered most was showing how her corruption had fractured the very fabric of the community. Samantha's greed had eroded the trust that holds neighborhoods together. And when investigators finally combed through her files, what they found would leave the entire neighborhood stunned. The full scale of her operation was far worse than anyone had imagined. Just how much money did she really steal? Let's just say it wasn't pocket change. So, Anna Dramenest view Ursa Broken Bar. What's your guess? The moment those 3 FBI vehicles rolled into the neighborhood, it shattered any illusion that this had been a simple dispute. Most of the residents had never seen anything like it in their quiet, suburban enclave and certainly didn't expect it. Agent Harris stepped out of the lead SUV with the calm authority of someone who had done this many times before. Behind her were 2 agents, moving with quiet precision, quickly securing the area. This wasn't a routine arrest. This was the final act of a carefully planned federal sting operation. "Mrs. Samantha Wellington," Agent Harris called out, her voice firm and unmistakably the kind of voice shaped by years of courtroom testimony and high-stakes arrests. "You are under arrest for wire fraud, conspiracy to commit mail fraud, tax evasion, and violations of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act." To some of the neighbors, the charges might have sounded like legal jargon, but anyone with even a basic understanding of federal law knew exactly how serious those words were. Then came the metallic click of handcuffs, as sharp and final. It echoed down the street like a warning bell. You could feel the entire neighborhood freeze, holding its breath. Time seemed to pause. Samantha's legs gave out for a moment as the shock finally settled in. For years, she'd been operating with arrogance and entitlement, assuming no one would challenge her authority. Now, that illusion was crumbling. "This is illegal," she cried, her voice cracking with a mix of fury and panic. "I am the HOA president. You can't just barge into our community and arrest someone for doing their job." But Agent Harris had heard this before. It was the same script, the same desperate cries from white-collar criminals when their world collapsed around them. They always tried to frame their actions as just business, always claimed they were being persecuted for doing things by the book. But seasoned federal agents know better. They've learned to ignore the noise and focus on the evidence. "Yes, ma'am, you do have rights," I said calmly, stepping forward as two agents escorted Samantha toward one of the waiting federal vehicles, "including the right to legal counsel who will explain exactly what happens when you defraud your neighbors and use federal systems to cover your tracks." That's when Agent Harris turned to the assembled residents and delivered a bombshell. Her next words left everyone speechless. "A broken bar reveals fraudulent charges and thefts totaling more than $47,000 from community funds over a span of 4 years, Agent Harris announced, her voice cutting clearly through the tension that hung over the lawn. Everyone could hear her. "No more secrets." She laid it all out: payments made to fake companies, unauthorized personal spending using HOA accounts, and a consistent pattern of silencing residents who dared to question discrepancies. The figure $47,000 hit the crowd like a lightning bolt. You could see it in their expressions, the way some shook their heads and others stared off in disbelief. For years, they'd been paying dues, believing they were supporting repairs, improvements, and upkeep. Instead, they were unknowingly funding someone's private bank account. This wasn't just petty theft. It was a long-running, organized scheme that had gone unnoticed for years, financed by the very people now standing there, stunned. The same woman they had elected to manage community affairs had been using that trust as cover to rob them blind, all while intimidating anyone who got too close to the truth. Fred Grant stepped forward first, his face flushed with a mixture of vindication and long-simmering fury. $47,000, he repeated loudly, his voice rising with every syllable. "That's our money. That's what we've been paying every month, thinking it was for better roads, better lighting, better everything." His words seemed to crack something open in the crowd. Suddenly, everyone was talking, voices overlapping as residents shared their own encounters with suspicious charges and threats. Mrs. Patterson, who lived directly across the street, raised her voice above the clamor. "She billed us $800 last winter for emergency gutter cleaning," she exclaimed, trembling with anger. "We paid it. Not a single worker ever showed up. Our gutters are still packed with leaves from last fall." A younger father pushed his way forward. His face was red, his jaw tight with emotion. "She banned my kids from playing in our front yard," he said, "then slapped us with a violation fee for a lawn misuse because they left a couple of toys outside overnight." One by one, more stories surfaced, each adding another layer to the mountain of abuse. An elderly man named Mr. Smith described being threatened with a property lien after requesting a full copy of the HOA budget. Another woman, middle-aged and visibly frustrated, recounted being fined hundreds of dollars for unauthorized landscaping after she planted flowers in her own backyard without HOA board approval. Every voice painted the same horrifying picture: a neighborhood ruled by fear, manipulated by a woman who wrapped her crimes in the language of responsibility and order. Samantha had weaponized her role and silenced dissent with threats and bureaucracy. Even with federal agents at her side and steel handcuffs locking her wrists, Samantha wasn't ready to accept reality. "I was preserving property values," she shouted, her voice cracking from a mix of rage and disbelief. "You have no idea how hard it is to enforce standards when no one follows the rules. Every single dollar I spent was for this community." It was the same tired defense she'd been using for years. Dress up theft as leadership, frame control as protection, rebrand bullying as dedication to community values. But none of it could hide the truth now. I stepped forward, my voice calm, steady and measured, as it had been through every stage of this investigation. "Mrs. Wellington," I said, "true leadership doesn't involve stealing from your own community. Real improvements don't require fake businesses and falsified invoices. And maintaining standards doesn't mean threatening your neighbors when they simply ask where their money is going." Agent Harris gave me a firm nod as she watched Samantha being loaded into the back of the unmarked vehicle. The evidence was overwhelming. The damage she'd caused to the community trust undeniable. As the SUV carrying Samantha drove off, something changed in the neighborhood. You could feel an emotional weight beginning to lift. For the first time in years, people felt safe enough to speak openly about what they had experienced. There was no longer fear of retaliation for asking questions. Neighbors who had avoided eye contact now formed small groups on sidewalks, exchanging stories and trying to piece together how deep the fraud had gone. Talk of reform filled the air. Discussions on oversight, transparency, and new leadership. Fred Grant, who had once seemed like a lone voice in the wilderness, suddenly had a crowd around him and neighbors asking for copies of his notes, wanting to hear what he'd uncovered over the years, and thanking him for never giving up. The legal process moved swiftly, as federal cases often do when the facts are this clear-cut. With 4 months of surveillance recordings, emails, financial statements, and first-hand accounts of broken bar, Samantha's legal team quickly came to the conclusion that fighting the charges would be pointless and financially draining. Ultimately, she accepted a plea deal that required her to fully reimburse the community, serve 6 months under house arrest, complete 2 years of probation, and be permanently barred from holding any HOA leadership position anywhere in the United States. But what happened next surprised everyone and began a healing process no one had anticipated. 2 weeks after Samantha's arrest, I stood once again in the Lake office where the entire drama nest had kicked off. Yet everything felt transformed. The same building that had once symbolized secrecy and control now buzzed with collaborative energy as neighbors gathered to organize the first open home meeting in over 4 years. Fred Grant sat at my old desk, reviewing financial records with a small group of residents, who for the first time could see exactly where their money had been going. The change was remarkable. Gone was the secrecy and replaced by a community-wide effort to understand and improve their own neighborhood. Sheriff Morgan dropped by that morning to check in on how things were shaping up. As we stood on the porch watching kids play freely on a lawn that had once been off-limits under Samantha's rule, I noticed the ease in his expression. "Agent Hayes," he said, "this is one of those rare times where you really get to see justice do more than just punish. It actually helps people heal. That's what makes this job worth it." I knew exactly what he meant. Most of my work involved locking people up and tracking stolen funds. But rarely do I get to witness the kind of transformation that happens when the source of toxicity is removed. That's when I made a decision even I hadn't expected. I picked up the phone and called my supervisor at the regional FBI office. I requested extended leave at time off to help this neighborhood rebuild its entire governance model. "Agent Hayes," my supervisor said when I explained my reasoning, "you've already closed the case and secured the conviction. What you're doing now that's above and beyond." But I knew this was the right thing to do. These people had spent years under an authoritarian grip. They needed support to transition to something better, something fair. And, as it turns out, the same skills that make someone a good federal agent: attention to detail, understanding of financial processes, organizing complex systems are exactly the skills a recovering community needs. The first official community meeting under the new system was a sight to behold. The Lake office was filled with residents who had been too afraid to participate in home matters for years. At the front stood Fred Grant, a confident, composed, and finally heard. For the first time in 4 years, he told the group, "I can show you where every single dollar goes." He projected the budget on the wall, laying out each category of spending, each vendor payment, and every admin cost. There were no hidden figures, no vague explanations, just clarity. It was revolutionary. Instead of being stonewalled by silence or threats, residents were now welcomed into the financial conversation, and perhaps most importantly, the culture of the community had shifted. Kids who had once been warned not to ride their bikes or play outside could now enjoy their neighborhood freely. Parents who had once tiptoed around in fear of being fined began coming together, organizing events, brainstorming beautification projects, and discussing neighborhood safety. Even the suggestion box in the lake office, which Samantha had used to collect anonymous complaints, had been turned into something more fitting: a snack tray during community meetings. It was a small, symbolic change that captured just how different things had become. People were no longer reporting on each other, they were working together. One afternoon, while I was working on my laptop in the lake office, a group of kids walked up to me. One of them asked in that innocent, curious way only kids can, "Mr. Rob, how did you know she was lying about the rules?" It was a great question, and it went to the core of what I had learned from this entire experience. I leaned back in my chair and replied, "When someone says they're using your money to help you, they should be more than willing to show you exactly how." Honest people don't get angry when you ask for proof, but if someone refuses to be transparent or gets upset when questioned, it's usually a sign something's wrong. The kids listened carefully, taking in the lesson on transparency and accountability. But there was one more point I wanted to make, something even more important. The most valuable thing in any community, I continued, is that everyone gets a voice, and everyone can see what's being done with shared resources. Problems happen when one person is making all the decisions in secret. These weren't just lessons about home management, they were lessons for life. Whether those kids found themselves one day in a student council, a boardroom, or running their own neighborhood association, Samantha's sentencing didn't just bring closure, it brought healing. And when the court-mandated restitution was completed, this community didn't just break even, they were better than before, stronger, smarter, and united by a renewed sense of shared purpose. The transparency requirements that had been implemented weren't just legal obligations, they had become the foundation for something the neighborhood had never truly experienced before: trust. As part of the settlement, the HOA's finances would now be routinely audited and made entirely transparent to the public. Updated bylaws ensured that no single individual could ever again hold the kind of unchecked power that had allowed Samantha's misconduct to flourish. More than that, the entire experience had created a new generation of residents, of people who now understood how their community should be run and were committed to maintaining fair, democratic oversight of their neighborhood affairs. I couldn't help but smile as I watched the evening barbecue that had become a cherished weekly tradition. Families gathered around picnic tables spread out across the lawn where Samantha's old no-gathering signs had once loomed. Children played freely in spaces that had previously been off-limits without any real reason. Adults chatted about community plans with a spirit of openness and teamwork, the kind of energy that makes neighborhoods thrive. Fred Grant was working the grill in an apron that proudly read interim treasurer chief cook, while others handed out food and organized games. The difference from just a few weeks earlier, when fear and mistrust defined every interaction, was truly astonishing. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden light across the lake and the office building that had once served as the nerve center for my investigation, I found myself reflecting on everything this experience had taught me about justice, about healing, and about the resilience of everyday people. The federal case against Samantha Wellington had been significant. We'd recovered stolen funds, secured a conviction, and set an important legal precedent for prosecuting HOA corruption. But the most meaningful victory wasn't found in the courtroom, it was right here. Watching a neighborhood regain its strength, seeing people trust each other again, witnessing a community realize that it didn't need a dictator to function, it only needed transparency, collaboration, and mutual respect. That's the kind of result that doesn't show up on a case report or get mentioned in press briefings. But for those of us who do this work, it's often the most fulfilling kind of outcome. My supervisor had been right when he said the FBI doesn't normally get involved in community rebuilding, but sometimes, the most important work begins after the handcuffs come off and the investigation is over. This neighborhood needed more than a conviction. They needed someone to remind them how a real community works, of how it feels to be led, not ruled. And even long after I returned to my regular duties, the Lake office would remain a symbol of that transformation. A place of openness, of shared responsibility, and of neighborhood empowerment. A permanent reminder that accountability and participation are the true pillars of strong local governance. As I stood on the porch, watching families laugh, eat, and enjoy the space they had once feared, I felt a sense of fulfillment that no award or headline could ever match. Being a federal agent isn't always about high-profile arrests or dramatic takedowns. Sometimes, it's about the quieter work of listening, investigating, and helping people rebuild their trust in systems they thought had failed them. But here's the twist. This isn't the only HOA president out there committing federal crimes. Would you recognize the warning signs if it happened in your own neighborhood? Have you ever had to deal with an HOA gone completely off the rails? Here at Nest, we believe that everyday people are capable of extraordinary things, especially when they refuse to be silenced by phony authority figures. Whether it's a corrupt HOA leader, a shady contractor, or any scammer looking to exploit your community, the most powerful defense is staying informed and speaking up. If you found this story as satisfying to hear as I found it to live through, hit that like button so others can see what real justice looks like. Ever had a run-in with a rogue HOA or a broken community system? Drop your story in the comments, as some of them are absolutely wild. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time as we dive into another unbelievable case. Real people, really bad choices. Always worth hearing. Click like, hit subscribe, and get ready for more from Nest.